Have you ever trusted someone so completely, only to discover their entire love was built on lies? In today's story, we step into the life of David, a man who thought he had the perfect marriage, until late-night calls, hidden messages, and one shocking discovery in room 3 revealed a betrayal he could no longer ignore. What followed was not anger, not confrontation, but a silent war so devastating it destroyed his cheating wife's world piece by piece. This is she lied, I disappeared, and made my cheating wife's life a living hell. You're watching Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoy these powerful stories, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more dramatic tales. Now, let's begin this unforgettable story. On paper, David and Emily looked like the kind of couple people held up as proof that love could survive grown-up life. 6 years married, 8 years together, calendars tied with dreams of a mortgage, a dog, and one day, a nursery painted fresh and filled with talcum powder. They even had a ritual for separation. When she traveled for work, they FaceTimed every night. She would kick off her heels, he would lean the phone against a coffee mug on the counter, and they would exchange the small weather reports that make a life. I am tired. The meeting went long. The neighbor's cat is on our porch again. Then the kiss to the camera, the soft goodnight that felt every time like a hand resting on his chest. The first night of this trip fit the script. Her hair pinned up, eyes alive with the rush of a long day. She described the office abroad, the cedar scent of the conference room, the way the partner company laughed too loudly but welcomed her quickly. The second night was later. She looked away from the screen more than she looked at him. She promised she would sleep early. She didn't. On the third night, her text arrived instead of a call. She was going to the sauna with women from the team, she said. Cultural, she added. It would help her unwind. David typed back something supportive, something light, then stared at the blinking dots and tried to recall how trust once came without effort. 2.5 hours passed. Then, only a message. Going to bed, love you. No video call, no detail about steam rooms, eucalyptus oil, or loud lobbies. Just a sentence that closed the door and left him standing on the hallway side. The silence filled the kitchen like cold air. He told himself not to be the husband who policed routines. He made tea. He washed a pan. He set his phone face down but never moved away from it. He had been here before, though not with Emily. Years earlier, in a different life, he had ignored the pacing footsteps of intuition. That ignorance had cost him months he would never get back. He promised himself the next time he would listen. Tonight, that vow returned, silent but heavy, and sat with him at the table. Memory began to reorder ordinary scenes into something less innocent. Ryan, the colleague she mentioned in passing like traffic, always there, supposedly harmless. He thought of the time she laughed about an inside joke, only to catch herself mid-sentence, as if stepping too far into someone else's living room. He thought of the sudden wave of affection before this trip, her kisses landing a beat late, her hugs that let go first. He lifted the phone, typed a simple question. Long day, you okay? She answered with reassurance that read more like a memo. Busy, exhausted, will sleep, love you. He read it twice. The words carried none of her voice. He knew her voice. Even in one word he could hear it. Tonight he heard nothing. David walked to the window. The city outside hummed with its quiet negotiations of night. A bus sighed. A couple argued softly, careful of the neighbors. He wanted to believe in time zones and poor hotel Wi-Fi. He wanted to believe travel made people strange. But the body knows what it knows before the mind writes it down. When the kettle clicked off, he realized he had boiled water for nothing. He set the cup aside, opened his notes app. If trust was to be rebuilt, it would not be on the soft clay of maybes. He needed timestamps, patterns, not to prosecute her, he told himself, but to protect himself. To shield against the kind of story that unravels a man thread by thread. He did not write accusations, he wrote observations. Later than usual, no FaceTime, sauna detail missing. Ryan mentioned twice this month without prompt. It looked paranoid. It also looked like the beginning of a map. He closed the phone, turned off the light, stood in the doorway a second longer as if memorizing how safety once felt. Then he lay in bed, eyes open to the ceiling, and made another vow. Tomorrow he would stop hoping for rhythm to return on its own. Tomorrow he would follow whatever breadcrumb the truth dared to leave in reach. David had promised himself he would not look. He knew curiosity could turn a man into his own executioner. But Emily's laptop, left behind on their desk, blinked awake with every new notification, as if daring him. For 2 nights he ignored it. On the third, he sat down, tea cooling untouched at his side, and let the screen pull him in. At first, everything seemed harmless. Work chatter filled the chat window, logistics, schedules, colleagues joking about late dinners. He almost convinced himself it was nothing, and then he saw it. A heart wrapped in a Band-Aid, an emoji he had never seen her use before, sent not to him but to Ryan. It was small, cartoonish, almost childish. Yet in that moment it looked like a confession, an intimacy disguised as pixels, meant to soothe, meant to comfort, but not for him. The time stamp hit harder than the image. Emily had sent it minutes after texting David goodnight. 2 parallel conversations, 2 parallel selves, one for her husband, stripped of warmth and detail, one for her co-worker, marked with tenderness that had never belonged to them. David leaned back, his heart pounding against his ribs. He read the line again and again, as if repetition might turn it into something innocent. Instead, the words deepened like ink spilling across cloth. Then came the next message, 3 words that detonated every fragile defense he had left. Come to room 3. His throat tightened. His hands trembled on the keyboard. A dozen rationalizations rushed forward. Maybe others were involved. Maybe it was a meeting point. Maybe. But the thread was short and sharp, written with the efficiency of desire. And Ryan's reply an hour later was undeniable, going there. David could not move. The blinking cursor felt like a metronome marking the seconds of his collapse. He shouted once, a raw sound that tore from his chest, then clamped his fist against his mouth. He would not wake the neighbors. He would not admit the sound came from him. The night stretched endless. He sat in vigil before the screen, watching the words hang in the air like smoke he could not wave away. And then, as dawn pressed pale light against the blinds, the thread vanished, each message erased in real time. The heart, the invitation, Ryan's reply, all gone as if they had never existed. But they had existed. He had seen them, felt them. That was the moment denial died. His wife was not simply tired, not merely distant. She was unfaithful, and careful enough to hide it. The heart wrapped in a Band-Aid had split his own wide open. And the small, cartoonish symbol, harmless to anyone else, had become the sharpest knife Emily could ever wield. David did not sleep. The words come to room 3 and Ryan's blunt reply, going there, burned across the screen long after they disappeared. He sat hunched forward as if his vigilance could drag them back. The living room around him felt like an interrogation chamber, the only light the cold glow of betrayal. Minutes stretched into hours. The chat window remained still, empty, merciless. David's mind spun in circles, chasing fragile possibilities. Maybe Ryan never went. Maybe Emily changed her mind. Maybe it meant nothing. But silence between messages speaks louder than any proof, and this silence roared. At 2 a.m., every sound stabbed him awake. A faint email alert, the muted buzz of a neighbor's phone, even the settling creak of his own apartment walls. His heart raced with each one, as though the world itself were conspiring to remind him of what he had seen. He refreshed the thread compulsively, hoping for contradiction, for some clue that could restore the illusion. Nothing came. By 4 a.m., exhaustion dragged at his body, but his eyes refused to close. He stared at the screen like a man watching his own execution. What he needed was confirmation. What he received was far worse. Near dawn, the thread shifted before his eyes. Line by line, the conversation dissolved. The bandaged heart emoji, the invitation, Ryan's answer. One by one they vanished, erased in real time, until only blankness remained. For a moment, David thought it was a glitch. He refreshed, he reloaded, he prayed, but the emptiness stayed, and emptiness was an answer. Deleting meant intent. Erasure meant planning. Emily had not stumbled into a mistake. She was orchestrating a cover-up. The woman who once swore to share every truth with him was now managing lies with surgical precision. His chest felt hollow, as if the deletion itself carved him open. The betrayal wasn't just in what she had done, but in the way she erased him from the record of her life. It was not only an affair, it was an erasure of the man he had been to her. As the first pale light slipped through the blinds, David sat in silence, fists clenched, breath ragged. All night he had begged the universe for a miracle, for his suspicions to prove unfounded. Instead, he was forced to watch the execution of trust in real time. The night did not end with closure. It ended with absence, a blank screen, a marriage reduced to nothing more than a vanished thread. And as the sun rose, David knew with brutal certainty, sleep would not come again, not that night, not for many nights after. The night of room 3 had hollowed David out, but emptiness does not stay empty. It fills with dread. He needed to see Emily's face again, to hear her voice, if only to confirm that the woman who appeared on the screen was no longer the wife he thought he knew. When Emily finally called the next evening, her smile arrived too quickly, too bright, stretched thin over nerves she could not disguise. She panned her phone across the hotel room, bed neatly made, suitcase zipped. The space staged like a set prepared for inspection. Everything was in order, too much in order. And then in a moment too small to be planned, the mask slipped. She shifted the camera, adjusting her angle, and David saw it. A blotch of angry red spread across her chest, climbing to her collarbone, disappearing beneath the neckline of her loose shirt. His stomach clenched. He knew that mark. It was the kind of flush left by lips pressed too hard, by stubble scraping skin, by touch that lingered where it never should have been. A scarf could not leave that behind, nor could stress nor sauna steam. What happened there? His voice came out sharper than he intended, but he didn't retract it. Emily blinked, then laughed, soft but brittle. Oh, this, probably from my scarf, rough wool. I wore it all day. David said nothing. His silence pressed harder than accusation. She tugged at her neckline as though hiding the mark could erase it, then stumbled into another excuse. Or maybe I scratched myself. You know how clumsy I am. But David remembered. She was not clumsy. Not once in their years together had she ever injured herself like that without knowing it. And scarves did not leave bruises shaped like fingerprints. Her words tumbled into distraction. She asked about his day, about the weather, about anything that might shift the light away from her skin. Each sentence fell like plaster over cracked walls, hurried, uneven. David studied her face. Her smile wavered at the edges, her eyes darting away from the lens as if even the walls behind her might rise up and testify. For years he had believed every detail she offered. Tonight every detail rang false. The call ended with the familiar routine. Her blowing a kiss toward the camera, the same gesture she had always used. But even that tonight felt rehearsed, hollow, mocking. David sat in the dim light of his kitchen, replaying the image in his mind. The red marks, the fragile laugh, the collapsing facade. The truth no longer needed words. It was written on her body. And for the first time, David no longer felt torn between doubt and hope. The confusion drained away, leaving only certainty. Certainty that the woman smiling through that screen was already gone. What remained was an actress, scrambling to keep her mask from slipping, performing a marriage that had already died. By the time the call ended, David's hands were trembling so badly he could barely set the phone down. The red marks, the brittle excuses, the hollow laugh, all of it replayed in his mind like a broken reel. He had enough to feel the truth in his bones, but not enough to act. If he confronted Emily now, she would cry, twist, deny, until his anger bent back against him. He knew her talent for dramatics, for turning accusation into pity. What he needed wasn't another emotional battle. What he needed was clarity, strategy, protection. The next morning, David booked an appointment with Marcus Lee, a divorce attorney recommended by a colleague. Marcus was sharp-eyed, mid-30s, the kind of man who carried calm the way others carried weapons. His office smelled faintly of leather and old books, walls lined with degrees that reassured David he wasn't the first broken man to sit across that desk. David told him everything, the sudden distance, the late-night texts, The heart wrapped in a Band-Aid, the invitation to room 3, the thread deleted in real time, the red marks she couldn't explain, the lies about scarves and clumsiness. The words poured out in a rush, as though if he said them fast enough they might hurt less. Marcus listened in silence, tapping his pen against a yellow legal pad. He jotted occasional notes, but never interrupted. When David finally stopped, throat dry and hands still unsteady, Marcus leaned back in his chair. "You have suspicion," Marcus said evenly. "You have fragments, but right now you don't have enough, not for court, not even for yourself. If you confront her now, she'll bury the rest. You'll lose the chance to know the full extent of it." David rubbed his temples. "So what do? I can't keep living like this." Marcus set the pen down with quiet precision. "You go silent. Don't accuse, don't demand. Don't let her know you suspect a thing. Ghost her. Let her feel the vacuum. Women like your wife, silence terrifies them. They can't stand it. She'll move, and when she moves, she'll reveal more than she ever intended." The word ghost rattled in David's chest. Silence as a weapon. Absence as revenge. It was cruel in its simplicity. For years, he had been the man who confronted, who demanded, who tried to fix things. But Marcus was right. Truth would not come by force. It would come through patience, through letting Emily stew in her own lies until they fermented into confession. "You also need to protect your assets," Marcus continued. "Bank accounts, car, anything she could shift out of reach if she senses divorce, and gather evidence, screenshots, recordings, timestamps, quietly, methodically, piece by piece." David nodded, the weight of the plan settling inside him. This wasn't going to be a war of shouting matches or ultimatums. It would be a colder war, one fought with silence and patience as the blade. When he left Marcus's office, the afternoon sun was sharp on his face. For the first time in weeks, he felt steady. The plan was simple: say nothing, show nothing, let the silence grow until it became unbearable. Emily would believe she still held the upper hand, and in that illusion she would slip. As David walked to his car, Marcus's words echoed in his mind: ghost her. Let her feel the absence. Let her reveal herself. David tightened his grip on the steering wheel. If silence was to be his weapon, he would wield it with precision. From this moment forward, Emily would not hear from him what she craved most: his attention, his reaction, his absolution. She would hear nothing, and in that nothing, her world would begin to unravel. David had promised Marcus he would stay silent, collect evidence, build the case brick by brick. But silence did not mean idleness. Every night after work, he opened Emily's laptop like a vault of secrets. The glow of the screen painted his living room in cold light as he combed through every line, every notification, as if the truth might hide between the mundane. Most conversations were harmless: meeting notes, project schedules, jokes about late dinners, innocent enough on the surface. But David read them all like a detective who knew the killer had left fingerprints somewhere. And then one night he found it. At first glance, the exchange seemed trivial: Emily asking Ryan about a book, a playful backhand forth about whether it was in his room or hers, whether he should deliver it later. She teased that maybe it was already with her. He joked that perhaps his gum was still there. Out of context, it looked childish, meaningless. But David's chest tightened. He knew his wife. She was not the kind of woman who bantered this way, not with him, and certainly not with another man. The timing told the story, always late at night, always after she had signed off from David. He read it again, slower this time. "The book is here already. Glad you've got it. Maybe I need some gum now." These weren't words about novels or chewing gum. They were code, a flimsy disguise for midnight visits. The book was the excuse. The gum was the invitation. Every line was a shadow covering what had already happened. David's throat burned as he scrolled further. The ease of it all, the familiarity, told him this wasn't new. This wasn't flirtation dancing on the edge of danger. This was two people already comfortable in betrayal. His fingers shook as he took screenshots, each message captured and saved into a private folder. Proof finally solid. Marcus's plan echoed in his mind: silence, patience, evidence. And yet, even as he saved the files, grief tore through him. This was the smoking gun, the undeniable confirmation that the woman he loved had chosen another man. He closed the laptop slowly, carefully, as though lowering the lid on a coffin. The apartment around him was silent, but the silence no longer felt like his weapon. Tonight it felt like a witness, heavy, suffocating, testifying against the life he thought he had. David leaned back in his chair, pressing his palms hard against his eyes until sparks of light burst behind them. There was no going back now. Doubt had ended. Hope had ended. He had the proof he thought he wanted, but it came with a weight he could hardly bear. The only question that remained was how much further Emily would fall before she realized David was no longer the man she could deceive. The screenshots of the book and gum exchange stayed open on David's phone like scars he could not stop tracing. He read them again and again in the stillness of his apartment, the low hum of the refrigerator the only sound to break the silence. With each reread, memories began to reorder themselves, scenes once harmless now sharpened into darker shapes. He remembered the company happy hour, the first time he had seen Ryan and Emily in the same room. Emily had been magnetic, laughing too loudly, teasing colleagues with her usual charm. But with Ryan, something had been different. She leaned closer than necessary, her hand brushing his arm as though gravity pulled her there. The contact lasted a breath too long. Later, when they hugged goodbye, David had noticed her fingers linger, curling into Ryan's sleeve. At the time, he told himself it was nothing. People hug, arms brush. He had been unfair, but now the memory burned. Another night resurfaced, cruel in hindsight. They had argued over something trivial, and Emily had stormed out with her backpack slung over her shoulder, claiming she would check into a hotel. It was midnight. No hotel would have taken her, not then. David had sat awake, waiting for the sound of the door, listening for the click that never came. In the morning, she was back, calm, collected, acting as if nothing had happened. And when he asked, she twisted his concern into accusation. "How dare you not trust me?" She had cried until his guilt smothered his instincts. He had apologized. He, the betrayed, had apologized to her. Piece by piece, the fragments aligned like stars, forming a constellation he had been too blind to see. The laughter, the touches, the unexplained absences, what once looked like quirks now revealed the outline of betrayal. The realization cut deeper than any text message ever could. The betrayal wasn't just in her body, in the secrets with Ryan, in the coded language she thought he would never see. It was in the way she had rewritten their history, reshaping his memories, teaching him to doubt himself. For years, every time his gut raised alarms, Emily had played the same card, anger, tears, accusations, until he questioned his own reality. She had built a theater where he was cast as the jealous husband while she played the misunderstood wife. And he had believed it. Love had blinded him to the stagecraft. Now, with the smoking gun in his hand, the curtain had fallen. The 6 years of marriage, he thought, were built on loyalty and trust collapsed into rubble. The illusion was gone. What remained was the ugly clarity of truth. David pressed his hands to his face, breathing hard. The grief was sharp, but beneath it stirred something new, resolve. He no longer doubted. He no longer hoped. Certainty, cold and absolute, had taken their place. Emily's mask had slipped, and once a mask slips, it can never be put back on. After the illusions shattered, David understood what Marcus had meant. Proof was only part of the battle. The real weapon was silence, so he began. When Emily texted her usual morning greeting, "Good morning, love, busy day ahead but thinking of you," he let the notification fade across the screen without reply. At noon, another ping. A photo of her coffee, a heart emoji, a small hook tossed into the water. David did not bite. His hands twitched with the urge to answer, to demand, to scream, but he held the line. That first day, silence felt like a blade turned inward, cutting him as much as it cut her. But Marcus's words rang steady. Don't accuse, don't demand, ghost her. Let her reveal herself. By evening, her tone shifted. 3 missed calls, 2 voicemails, 1 carefully worded email about how exhausting her project had been, how she missed the comfort of his voice. He read every word, dissected every line, but never typed back. The second day, her calm frayed. "Are you okay? Why aren't you answering? Did I do something? Please talk to me." She reached out to mutual friends, asking them to check on him. One even called David directly. His reply was short, steady, rehearsed. "I'm fine, just busy, nothing more." The less anyone knew, the stronger his silence became. By the third day, Emily's emails grew frantic, contradictory. In one, she begged for reassurance. In another, she promised to make more time for him. In the next, she accused him of being cruel. The contradictions spilled like cracks in a dam, impossible to patch. David watched from his quiet fortress, calm for the first time in weeks. Every unanswered call tilted the balance of power. Every silence became a mirror, forcing Emily to confront her own chaos. He could almost see her in that hotel room, pacing between bed and desk, inventing excuses to explain a husband slipping beyond her reach. This was not the revenge he once imagined. There was no shouting match, no grand exposure, no dramatic unveiling of evidence. This was sharper, colder, a war fought in absence where silence was the only weapon. That night, as his phone buzzed uselessly on the nightstand, David lay in bed with a strange clarity. Silence was not just punishing her, it was freeing him. For the first time in months, he was not reacting to her lies, he was dictating the pace. The war had begun, and in this war, David was no longer the victim, he was the strategist. Emily, frantic and cornered, was destroying herself in the echo chamber of his silence. By the end of the first week of silence, Emily's desperation had curdled into something darker. The messages no longer came at predictable hours. They arrived in floods, 2 a.m., 5 a.m., mid-afternoon, long, rambling emails full of contradictions. In one, she swore she loved him more than ever, that she couldn't wait to be home and fix everything. In another, written only hours later, she accused him of punishing her unfairly, of abandoning her when she needed him most. Each new note collided with the last, a pendulum swinging wildly between devotion and rage. David read them all stone-faced, but never replied. Marcus's warning echoed in his head. Don't break the silence. Don't give her an opening. Still, the words hit their mark, because woven among the contradictions were daggers designed to pierce him. I can't do this if you won't talk to me. I don't know if I can keep living like this. Maybe it would be better if I just disappeared for good. The first time she wrote it, David froze, his pulse hammered in his chest. He knew Emily's talent for dramatics, her instinct for manipulation. But suicide was not a word to dismiss. Was this another ploy to drag him back into her orbit, or was she truly teetering on the edge? The weight of choice pressed down. If he reached out, he risked unraveling the silent war he had built. If he ignored her, he risked something far worse. He chose the third path. He called the local police where she was staying, reported her suicidal language, gave them the hotel details. If she was truly in danger, they would act. If it was a performance, she would learn that even manipulation had consequences. When Emily found out, her messages sharpened into blades. I can't believe you'd humiliate me like that. How could you call the cops on your own wife? You don't trust me at all. But David did not reply, not a word. His silence was both shield and sword. Nights were hardest. He sat in his darkened apartment, phone buzzing again and again, his imagination filling the silence with her sobs. Once she left a voicemail, 30 seconds of muffled crying that ended with a whispered, "Please, David, I'll die without you." He listened once, then deleted it. He never pressed play again. For years, Emily had mastered emotional warfare, chaining him with guilt, twisting his compassion until it served her lies. But this time, his anger outpaced his pity. He had seen too much. The red marks, the erased messages, the coded exchanges. No amount of tears could undo what she had done. Revenge, he realized, was not shouting, not exposing her in front of colleagues, not public humiliation. It was this, silence so absolute that even her most desperate performance could not pierce it. Emily was learning, hour by hour, what it meant to scream into a void. And David, though something inside him cracked at hearing her beg for life itself, understood a new truth. She no longer had power over him. Every unanswered call was proof. Every day she spiraled while he stayed silent was a reminder. Control had shifted, permanently, and she would never get it back. The silence was driving Emily mad, and David could see it in the flood of words now filling his inbox. She had shifted tactics again, no longer begging, no longer threatening. This time she tried to explain. Each email arrived like a crafted confession, but no two ever matched. The first came on a Tuesday at 3 in the morning. Nothing happened that night. Ryan only came by for 5 minutes. We hugged, that's all. I was tired. Please don't think worse of me. David read it once, marked the time, saved it to his private folder. 2 days later, another email. Maybe it was 30 minutes. We talked about work, about stress. Yes, we hugged, but nothing beyond that. I just needed comfort. David compared the two side by side. 5 minutes had stretched into 30. Already the cracks widened. By Friday, the story shifted again. I admit I felt something. He made me laugh when I was exhausted, and I leaned on him. But there was no kissing, no touching beyond an embrace. I was weak, not unfaithful. David wrote in his notebook, admits emotional connection, still denies physical intimacy. Each version dripped with careful phrasing tailored to reduce her blame. Sometimes it was stress. The project nearly broke me. I wasn't myself. Sometimes alcohol. We had a drink. It blurred the lines. Sometimes even him. You've been distant, David. I felt lonely. I needed warmth. But David no longer read them as pleas for understanding. He read them as evidence exhibits. He cataloged contradictions the way Marcus had taught him, clinical, detached, methodical. One night she wrote that Ryan had walked in uninvited and she pushed him away. The next morning she admitted she had let him in but thought it harmless. Her memory wasn't shifting, it was rewriting. She was not searching for honesty. She was searching for the version that would hurt him least. And as the emails piled up, David realized something bitter but liberating. He no longer needed the real story. He already had it, because the truth was not in any single email. It was in their contradictions. Every edit, every 5 minutes that became 30. Every just a hug that grew into feelings. They were confessions all on their own. Emily believed she was buying forgiveness one edited truth at a time. What she didn't see was that each revision was another nail in the coffin of their marriage. David closed his laptop, calm, almost cold. He didn't need her final version. She had already told him everything he needed to know. By the time her 10th version of the truth arrived, Emily had run out of half measures. Her words took on a theatrical edge, as if she were staging a courtroom drama where she could still play the innocent wife. If you don't believe me, she wrote, then let me prove it. I'll take a polygraph test. I'll even go to a clinic. They can run tests, blood work, anything to show you I never slept with him. David read the email slowly, lips curving into something between a laugh and a grimace. A polygraph, a medical exam. To Emily, these were props, stage tricks meant to distract from the cracks in her story. But David didn't need wires or needles to see the truth. He had already seen it in her eyes when she lied about the red marks. He had heard it in her shifting words when 5 minutes became 30. No machine could measure what he already knew. Still, Emily pressed harder. The next voicemail carried her voice into frenzy. I'll go tomorrow morning, David. I'll sign anything. I'll prove I didn't betray you. Just tell me what you need me to do. Please, just talk to me. He didn't answer. Marcus's advice whispered back. She'll move, and when she moves, she'll reveal more than she ever intended. And this was exactly what was happening. The more she tried to claw back control, the more she exposed her desperation. David pictured it almost vividly. Emily strapped to a polygraph chair, heart racing, palms sweating, insisting she was innocent while her own body betrayed her. Or sitting under sterile hospital lights, begging a doctor to verify what her conscience already denied. The irony nearly made him laugh. She didn't want truth. She wanted loopholes. And yet, for all the drama, David felt no temptation to take the bait. He no longer cared about her games. The war was no longer about whether she could prove her purity with machines. It was about the fact that she had already destroyed trust, and trust could not be printed on a lab report. So he stayed silent. No replies, no phone calls, no validation. He let her twist in the net she had cast for herself. Each new promise of proof that never came was another thread of desperation tightening around her. In the stillness of his apartment, David understood what Marcus had truly meant. Revenge didn't require confrontation. It required patience. And patience was exactly the one thing Emily could not stand. He closed his laptop, leaving her latest email unopened, and leaned back in his chair. She thought she could win him back with machines and paperwork. But David already held the only verdict that mattered: her guilt, written in every contradiction, every nervous laugh, every desperate plea. The polygraph game was hers to play, but David had stopped playing a long time ago. Weeks had passed since the first silence began, and Emily's words now piled up like rubble: emails, voicemails, promises, threats. David had ignored them all, his silence sharper than any reply. But Marcus had been right. If you stayed quiet long enough, people filled the void with their own mistakes, and Emily wasn't the only one capable of slipping. One evening, after her latest dramatic email about polygraphs and doctors, David made a quiet decision. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he had never used before: Victoria. Emily's supposed roommate during the trip. The same Victoria whose presence, by implication, should have guaranteed Emily's innocence. He dialed. For a moment, he expected no answer. Then a cautious voice picked up. "Hello?" "Victoria," David said evenly, his tone calm, measured. "I just need clarity. That night, did someone come to the room?" The pause stretched long enough for David to hear her swallow. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of something rehearsed. "No, no one came in. Emily went to bed early. We both did." It was too smooth, too absolute, a denial written for someone else's benefit. David didn't argue. He simply let silence fill the line, and in that silence, Victoria faltered. "Well, I mean, maybe someone knocked," she stammered. "But they didn't come in." David still said nothing. Finally, her voice cracked. "Okay, yes, he came in, but only for a short time. Just a minute, maybe two. It wasn't what you think." Her rush of words told David everything. This wasn't just Emily's lie anymore. Victoria had been pulled into the web, forced into the role of reluctant accomplice. Her shifting story mirrored Emily's, changing details, downplaying events, trying to shield her friend with vagueness. But vagueness doesn't protect the truth. It exposes it. When David hung up, he didn't feel rage so much as clarity. The last missing piece had clicked into place. He had long suspected, long known in his gut, but now he had something more than circumstantial hints. He had independent confirmation, spoken reluctantly, yes, but spoken nonetheless. Ryan had been in that room. Emily had lied, and the cover-up stretched further than he imagined. For a moment, David sat in silence, exhaling slowly. The picture was complete now. The coded messages, the deleted threads, the red marks on her skin, the contradictions in her emails, and now the slip from her own roommate. Each piece alone could be contested, but together they formed a verdict no polygraph, no doctor, no performance could erase. Emily had betrayed him, and worse, she had dragged others into protecting the lie. The realization struck with a strange calm. Pain still lingered, yes, but alongside it rose something sharper: resolve. The war of silence had already broken her mask. Now David had the evidence to bury it for good. The time for doubt was over. The next act of his revenge was ready to begin. The silence had cornered Emily, and Victoria's slip had sealed her fate. When she finally returned home, she no longer looked like the confident woman who once carried herself with practiced poise. She looked smaller, diminished. Her eyes rimmed red, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her lies had finally crushed her spine. David stood in the kitchen when she walked in, arms crossed, face unreadable. For weeks she had poured herself into emails and phone calls, bargaining with words. Now she had nothing left but her body and her desperation. She dropped her bag by the door and stepped forward, hands trembling. "David," she whispered, her voice cracking, "please, please don't give up on us." He said nothing. Her knees buckled. She sank to the floor, clutching at the hem of his shirt like a penitent before a priest. Tears streaked her cheeks as she blurted out promises in a frantic rush. "We'll do therapy. I'll sleep in a separate room if you want. I'll cut everyone off. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it." Her voice broke into sobs. "I can change. I swear to you I can. Don't throw away 6 years. Don't throw away me." For the first time, David didn't feel pity. He looked down at her, but the woman on the floor was not the woman he had married. She wasn't pleading out of love, she was begging for stability, for the comfort of the man who had always picked up her pieces. He could see it clearly now. This wasn't remorse. It was fear. Fear of losing the house, the routine, the safety net she had always taken for granted. Her tears spattered against the hardwood, but David remained still. Silence, once a burden, now felt like armor. For years she had trained him to mistake breakdowns for honesty, sobs for sincerity. Tonight he saw them for what they were: tactics, desperate maneuvers from someone terrified of consequences. Emily clutched his hand, pressed it against her wet cheek, whispering, "Please, I can't live without you. I'll do anything." Slowly, deliberately, David pulled his hand free. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The absence of words was sharper than any argument, and in that silence he felt something break, not in him but in her. For years he had been chained by love, by guilt, by manipulation. But now, as she crumbled on the kitchen floor, he knew those chains had fallen away. Her tears no longer held power. They only confirmed what he already knew. The marriage wasn't being saved, it was ending. And for the first time, David understood. He was the one in control of how it ended. The night Emily collapsed in the kitchen, clutching his shirt and drowning in tears, had been the last thread. David didn't need to hear more promises, therapy, separate bedrooms, fresh starts. Every word had already been buried under months of lies and contradictions. He had seen the red marks. He had read the messages. He had heard the slips. Nothing she could say would ever erase the truth. So the next morning he made his move. One by one he closed every door. Her number blocked. Her emails filtered straight into a folder he would never open. Social media unfollowed, unfriended, erased. By noon his phone was silent, not because Emily had stopped trying, but because her voice no longer had a path to reach him. It was the cruelest kindness he could offer: complete absence. Emily noticed within hours. At first the messages came in bursts, each one carrying a different mask. Soft apologies, angry demands, pitiful pleas. When none reached him, she escalated. Calls from friends' phones, long letters to his work email, even attempts to reach him through mutual acquaintances. But David had already prepared. To anyone who asked, his reply was short, steady, final. "Everything goes through my lawyer." That single sentence became his shield. It drained the drama from every attempt, turned her chaos into empty noise. No shouting, no explanations, just the cold weight of procedure. Her fury grew. She screamed into voicemails he never heard, posted vague laments online that never reached his eyes. For years, she had been the center of attention, feeding on the reassurance that David would always come back, always cave to her tears. Now she was screaming into a void. Her friends called him cruel. Her family demanded answers, but David refused to be pulled back into the spectacle. "Talk to Marcus," he repeated. The lawyer was the wall between them, and every day Emily hurled herself against it, breaking further on the silence. What she didn't understand was that the silence itself was the punishment. Not exposure, not public humiliation, not a grand confrontation, just erasure. The absence of him, for David, each step away felt lighter. The apartment that had once been heavy with shadows grew calmer, steadier. He no longer jumped at the buzz of his phone. He no longer checked his inbox for her confessions. In choosing silence, he had reclaimed not only control but peace. Emily, meanwhile, was unraveling. The louder she screamed, the clearer it became. She no longer had power over him. The ghosting wasn't just strategy anymore. It was liberation. The silence had done its work. Emily's chaos was now walled off behind Marcus's legal letters, her voice reduced to echoes filtered through official documents. For David, the storm was finally over. And when storms pass, a man learns how much wreckage they leave behind. He left the house they once shared, a place heavy with shadows and echoes of betrayal. Instead, he rented a modest apartment downtown. It wasn't much. A single bedroom, a narrow kitchen, bare walls. But the windows faced east, and every morning sunlight spilled through them like a quiet benediction. For the first time in months, he woke without dread pressing against his chest. The air smelled of coffee and fresh paint, not of lies. David started small. He laced up a new pair of running shoes and pushed himself onto the pavement. The first runs were brutal, his lungs burning, but each step beat out the bitterness still lodged inside him. He began journaling again, not the frantic catalog of Emily's contradictions, but reflections. Who he wanted to be, what he wanted in life, what it meant to live without apology, without fear. Work came back into focus too. Without the constant drain of suspicion, his mind sharpened. Colleagues noticed the difference, his clarity, his energy. He met friends again, real friends he had neglected while drowning in the wreckage of his marriage. He laughed freely, surprised by the sound, as if hearing himself for the first time in years. And in those quiet mornings by the window, journal open, coffee steaming, David understood the greatest revelation of all. Revenge wasn't Emily's suffering. Revenge was that she no longer mattered. Her emails, her pleas, her tears, they belonged to a world outside his own. Each day forward was proof that she had lost the power to define him. Every step on the pavement, every line in his journal, every laugh in the company of friends, they were all acts of reclamation. He had thought revenge would taste like fire, sharp, burning, bitter, but it didn't. It tasted like freedom, like breath filling his lungs on a cool morning run, like sunlight on fresh paint, like peace. The man who had been consumed by betrayal was gone. In his place stood someone new, stronger, freer, and finally at peace. It arrived on a Sunday evening, just as the city outside David's window softened into dusk. His inbox chimed with a familiar name, one he hadn't seen in weeks, not since Marcus had built the legal wall that blocked her endless attempts. Somehow Emily had slipped through with an email marked urgent. The subject line read, "Please read, my last chance." For a moment, David hovered, finger frozen above the mouse. Then he opened it. The letter was long, frantic, pages of words tumbling over one another. She called it her truth, but every paragraph betrayed her. It began with apologies. "I'm sorry for hurting you. I'm sorry for lying," but almost immediately the lines twisted into justifications. "I was stressed. I was lonely. You weren't there the way I needed you." Her tone swung wildly, confession, then blame. Guilt, then self-preservation. She wrote of sleepless nights, of crying in hotel rooms, of praying he might forgive her. And threaded through it all was the same plea she had rehearsed 100 times before. "Don't leave me. We can rebuild. Please give me one more chance." David read every word, steady as stone. His pulse never quickened. Hope never flickered. He saw the letter for what it was, not repentance, not love, but desperation. A script from an actress who had run out of stages. When he reached the end, he scrolled back to the top, eyes landing once more on the subject line, "My last chance." Then he pressed delete. No reply, no reaction, no echo for her to cling to. Just silence, complete, absolute, unbreakable. For Emily, that silence would be the heaviest sentence, not rage, not scandal, not even the cold efficiency of court filings, but erasure. To be ignored by the man she once controlled, that was the most brutal revenge of all. For David, it was freedom. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and felt the final thread snap. No ghosts remained, no shadows lingered. His life was his again, untethered to her chaos. He rose, stepped onto the balcony, and let the evening breeze wash over him. Below, the city lights flickered alive, millions of stories, millions of futures. Somewhere among them, his new beginning waited. He was no longer the betrayed husband, no longer the man consumed by lies. He was whole. He was free. And as he closed the door behind him, he carried nothing of Emily with him. Only the knowledge that silence had spoken louder than any words ever could. And that is where David's story ends. Not with rage, not with scandal, but with silence. A silence so absolute that it became the sharpest revenge of all. Emily lost everything. Her lies, her power, her grip on him. David, on the other hand, walked away free, stronger than ever, ready to build a new life untouched by her betrayal. So tell me, if you were in David's shoes, would you have chosen silence as your weapon, or would you have confronted her face to face? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Thank you for watching today's story on Cheating Stories 7. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more dramatic tales, and hit the bell so you never miss the next chapter. Until next time.